Hello and welcome to this week's edition of TRP News. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I'm your host, James Andre, and here's what's been happening. This week in the Sanders versus Clinton saga, in the past week, Senator Sanders continued his campaign in New Hampshire, making several stops to hold town halls and give speeches. While supporters continue to hype the so-called surge of support for Sanders, the reality is that his numbers so far have moved very little. What most people are likely focusing on is his favorability or other specific polling points. This is not the same as polling on who voters are most likely to pick. That is still Clinton. Now, I have made no secret that I believe that Clinton is so far the best candidate for the Democratic nomination and for the presidency. While I think that Sanders is an important liberal player, I think he has a tendency to be a flag follower. That is, following and establishing positions on the issue of the day without thoughtful leadership when it comes to policy. I believe that this tendency leads him to become misleading and deceptive in an effort to beat the populist drum louder and louder. And there are statements like the one he made over the weekend, quote, "Something happened on the way to the coronation. It was me." Coronation? Isn't that a Republican smear that was first used in the 2008 campaign against Clinton and Obama? What's up with that? As a rational progressive, it's disappointing to see liberal leaders adopt the shady tactics of the right wing. Sanders is among a group that does so shamelessly. That group includes Elizabeth Warren, Robert Reich, and more than a few congressmen. These people see nothing wrong with twisting the facts and shamelessly misleading their constituency, like Reich did a few days ago in his article titled "The Revolt Against the Ruling Class," which featured an image of Hillary Clinton. Reich talks about how the public is fed up with the status quo in this country, and because of events like the savings and loan crisis and scandals like Enron and WorldCom. He then goes on to lament that not a single Wall Street executive has gone to jail. While technically true, he conflates the savings and loan crisis and Enron and WorldCom scandals with the financial collapse of the Great Recession. However, in the S&L crisis and with Enron and WorldCom, literally thousands of people were convicted of crimes. It's true that no top executives paid criminally for the Wall Street collapse, but Reich fails to point out in his article featuring a picture of Clinton that this is largely due to Republicans stripping away financial industry regulations and stripping federal agency budgets, so that in fact today there are few regulators that can understand the legal implications of Wall Street activity, let alone bring a federal case over it. Similarly, Sanders was just in the news criticizing General Electric for getting bailed out by the government during the Great Recession, yet shipping jobs overseas for cheap labor. Yes, GE has manufacturing plants overseas. They also have plants here in the United States. What Sanders deceptively fails to mention is that GE paid for its own bailout. It cost the federal government nothing, and in fact made the federal government $2.3 billion. Also, what Sanders fails to mention is that GE was actually planning bids for contracts that would have meant hundreds of U.S. jobs, but now is planning to move those jobs overseas. Why? Because the charter for the U.S. Export-Import Bank, the financial entity that provides financial backing for international contracts, was allowed to expire by Congress just this past week. GE now is seeking to base those contracts in countries that offer the kind of financial support they can no longer get here in the United States. Senator Sanders voted against the Export-Import Bank, allowing it to expire, calling it corporate welfare. And there's one of those terms again, corporate welfare. What does that actually mean? Well, I'm against quote-unquote corporate welfare, but I'm not against facilitating business to do what they do as a general overarching rule. There has to be some balance. There has to be some prioritization of business needs versus social and average citizenry needs, but facilitating these companies to do business on an international level is not necessarily a bad thing. I wish that Sanders had pointed out more specifically what he had against the Export-Import Bank. Unfortunately, the statement he made amounts to 2 or 3 paragraphs full of similar rhetoric. Meanwhile, the smears against Clinton continue, and if my anecdotal experience is any indication, they may have increased intensity a tick or two. Vague and meaningless criticisms about her corporate ties, criminal behavior, her lies, and a new one I heard this week, her aloofness on economic issues. But despite the smears and the talk of Sanders taking down Clinton, as Nate Silver writes, her favorability rating is about 85%, and her unfavorable rating is around 10%, right where it was in January. And despite the lauding of Sanders' liberal authenticity, Silver also writes, quote, Clinton is pretty liberal herself, and she and Sanders voted together 93% of the time in the 2 years they spent in the Senate together. So that's another myth. Clinton is not liberal. Personally, I think the record clearly demonstrates that Clinton is in fact even to the left of President Obama. She has a long and quite explicit record of supporting liberal issues and doing so perhaps not in the venue that the most extreme liberals or progressives would like, but nevertheless the record is there. Nate Silver also writes about the media bias in favor of Sanders, saying polls show him gaining in Iowa and New Hampshire receive lots of press coverage, whereas those that show him stalling out, like one released late last week, are all but ignored. Meanwhile, it was described as a game changer when Sanders announced that he'd raised $15 million in the spring, even as Clinton raised $45 million during the same period. And Silver says Clinton has little reason to deflate the Bernie bubble. Sanders may satiate the media's desire for a competitive Democratic primary without really making her vulnerable. So that's what I've said before, said again. I've talked to many people online. Just saw an article today before making this video. It's pretty much a done deal, folks. Clinton is going to be the nominee. I feel for you Sanders supporters. I'm not against Bernie per se. I do think Clinton is a better candidate. But when people say, well, we don't know what can happen, there can be a political revolution. And I've said it before and I say again, we can know what's going to happen. It is possible. We have a lot of history in regards to analyzing these things, and this is not some multi-candidate general election. This is a Democratic primary, and this is pretty much a done deal. That doesn't mean Bernie should quit, but as it stands now, as I've told others, my prediction is, and I think someone else has already made this prediction, early March, by March, Sanders is out of the race. So that's how it stands. To me, that's just the reality of the situation. So the truth is, most of the so-called criticism of Clinton is misinformation, misguided, or simply made up out of thin air. Among the most ironic, however, is the criticism of her corporate ties. It's ironic because there are those that view Clinton's experience in negotiating with global corporations and eliciting donations from them in the interest of the public good is somehow a detriment. Of course, most of these people cast the same aspersions against President Obama, and most of these people have very little understanding of what it takes these days to accomplish the most common sense policy initiatives. Investing in roads, sewers, and a modern power grid all seem like a no-brainer. Yet it is a struggle to take the smallest steps towards these goals. Many fail to realize that it is exactly corporate partnerships that have enabled the president to move forward in areas like education, renewable energy, climate change, and most recently, advanced computing. The U.S. is headed for another government shutdown October 1st because Congress cannot agree on spending. Yet the president has managed to collect billions of dollars from private industry to move forward with his agenda. It seems clear that Clinton will be even more effective using this method. So in fact, it is those corporate ties that may be the best weapon progressives have in making a difference in the next 2 election cycles. Whoever you decide is the best candidate, no progressive should be adopting right-wing tactics, and no progressive should be using lies and smears to forward any agenda. You may not think Clinton is the best candidate, but don't deny, denigrate, or try to diminish her long record of supporting liberal causes. And Bernie Sanders supporters, as I told someone online the other day, be careful, you're locking your candidate into an echo chamber that ultimately will sideline him. You have to face reality, you have to face the facts, and as I've said to more than a few people, I just find it a little bit amusing how so many Sanders supporters talk about an oligarchy and a ruling class and how money has compromised politics and corporations are running the show, and then say somehow Sanders can win. It's contradictory, folks. It doesn't make sense, and if you're right, then he can't win. It goes against your own view of the state of play in politics. If everything is as you say, then Sanders can't win. And if everything isn't as you say, Sanders still can't win, unfortunately. I do agree with a lot of his message, but as I said, the flag following is a bit of a concern for me. And I told you before, the deceptive rhetoric on things like TPP and other economic issues just makes me a little nervous. As reader Madeline Conant put it in a comment in the New York Times, quote, as regard to Hillary Clinton, the woman has been mocked and lampooned by the right wing for decades, and then people are miffed because she seems cautious. She chooses her words carefully, but then she's called secretive. The press itself has trumpeted her as the presumptive candidate for 2 years and then describes her as entitled. She'll never be one of the good old boys. No one will ever describe her as someone they'd like to have a beer with, and Maureen Dowd will never have a good word for her, but she's smart, tough, experienced, hardworking, and a Democrat. That's good enough for me. The deal on Iran's nuclear research program has been approved by the UN Security Council and is currently being reviewed by the United States Congress. Secretary of State Kerry has been on tour to sell the deal here and abroad. Secretary of State Kerry arrived in Qatar Sunday to meet with the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, in regards to the deal. The GCC is comprised of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. Some GCC members have raised concerns that sanctions relief will allow Iran to widen its influence. At home, it is widely expected that Republicans will pass a disapproval of the deal, which the president has promised to veto. While the veto could be overturned, Pelosi said of fellow Democrats, more and more of them have confirmed to me that they will be there to sustain the veto. 44 Democrats in the House and 13 Democrats in the Senate would have to join Republicans to get the two-thirds majorities in both chambers needed to override the veto. Both houses of Congress returned to Washington on September 8th. Congress then has until September 17th to accept or reject the pact. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the organization that will be responsible for the monitoring and verification of Iran's nuclear program, will brief the Foreign Relations Committee this week. A recent Washington Post ABC News poll found 56% of Americans support the deal, even though more than 6 in 10 Americans say they're not confident it will work. This week, President Obama announces the final rule on greenhouse gas emissions limits on U.S. power generation plants. Last year, the Obama administration proposed the first limits in U.S. history, beginning a year-long review and resulting in more than 4 million public comments. The rules call for a 32% reduction in carbon emissions from power plants by 2030 from 2005 levels. Obama's rule assigns customized targets to each state, then leaves it up to the state to determine how to meet them. 20 to 30 states were poised to join the energy industry in suing over the rule as soon as it's formally published, which will be this Monday, the 3rd. The president has stated that power plants are the single biggest source of the harmful carbon pollution that contributes to climate change, but until now, there have been no federal limits to the amount of that pollution those plants can dump into the air. Because of the new rules and incentives included in the plan, the percentage of U.S. electricity coming from renewables is expected to rise to 28% by the year 2030. The White House and environmental advocates argue that the rule will stimulate the economy, create tens of thousands of jobs, as well as strengthen the U.S. hand when it comes to global efforts to combat climate change. The Fukushima nuclear plant was in the news again as workers made a significant step forward by removing a 20-ton machine from the fuel pool of Reactor 3. The fuel handling machine was used to replace spent nuclear fuel assemblies with new ones and is now useless following the accident. TEPCO, the plant operator, says that it will be removing smaller debris from the reactor before it begins removal of fuel from the pool. That operation is said to begin sometime in 2018, 7 years after the earthquake and subsequent tsunami that caused the accident. Also reported this week, former executives from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant will be indicted over the 2011 incident. They are former Tokyo Electric Power Chairman Tsuneisa Katsumata, then Vice President Sakemuto, and former Vice President Ichiro Takikuro. A parliamentary report in Japan has said Fukushima was a man-made disaster caused by Japan's culture of reflexive obedience, but no one has been punished criminally. Advocates have called for about 36 company officials to be held accountable for their failure to take proper measures to protect the site against tsunamis. Although the March 11 earthquake and tsunami killed 18,000 people, the nuclear disaster it caused is not officially recorded as having directly killed anyone. The most lasting health impact of the Fukushima nuclear disaster will likely be psychological, not physical, according to 3 studies. The Japanese government has also announced that more than 7,000 residents from a Fukushima town completely evacuated following the 2011 nuclear crisis will be able to return home permanently this September. The 7,401 residents of Naraha will become the first evacuees able to return home permanently among the 7 Fukushima municipalities whose entire populations were ordered to leave following the crisis. The government announced that Naraha's decontamination was completed, with radiation contamination down 60% from 2011 levels to 0.3 microsievert per hour. In other news from Fukushima, a renewable energy pilot project has taken a significant step. A 7-megawatt floating offshore wind turbine developed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries has been moored at the Fukushima demonstration site 20 kilometers offshore. A task force referred to as the Fukushima Prefecture Offshore Wind Power Study Council is considering expanding that total output at the offshore wind farm to 80 megawatts by the year 2020. And this past week in France, it was reported that migrants in Calais, a town and major ferry port in northern France, have been making thousands of attempts to breach security and enter the 30-mile-long tunnel connecting France and Britain. The migrants, estimated to number around 200 by an Associated Press journalist, faced off for close to an hour with security forces. Migrants have been scaling fences near the tunnel, often referred to as the chunnel, in recent weeks, trying to hop on freight trains and trucks destined for Britain. The incident has prompted not only a crisis response meeting by the UK government, but an extra £7 million, or $10.9 million, to ramp up security at the French entry point for the tunnel. The British Home Office said there were over 8,000 illegal border crossing attempts intercepted between June 21st and July 11th. Migrants in Calais have made arduous journeys from across the Middle East and North Africa, having left war-torn Syria or human rights abuses in Eritrea, Afghanistan, and Sudan. Over the weekend, Italy's Coast Guard said about 1,800 migrants were rescued from 7 overcrowded vessels on Saturday, while 5 corpses were found on a large rubber boat carrying 212 others. 2,000 are thought to have died this year attempting to cross the Mediterranean. About a quarter of arrivals this year have come from Eritrea, followed by Nigerians, Somalis, Sudanese, and Syrians, according to the UN Refugee Agency. Italy has had about 90,000 sea migrants arrivals so far this year, after receiving 170,000 in 2014, the agency says. And in Britain, news of new measures aimed at illegal immigrants. Landlords who fail to evict migrants who do not have the right to live in Britain could be jailed for up to 5 years under measures to be included in an immigration bill. Private landlords will also be able to evict illegal immigrants without a court order. The new measures will only apply in England. Of course, one has to wonder, if Britain spent that $10 million helping the desperate and displaced instead of on fences, cameras, and guards, what the impact would be. Here at home last year, 315,943 migrants were removed from the U.S., according to statistics from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which had a budget of $5.8 billion. And that's it for this week. I want to thank you once again for joining me. Tune in next week. We'll be keeping you posted on ongoing news and events from a progressive perspective. I'm James Andre. If you have any comments, criticisms, or suggestions, please let me know in the comments below the video or on Facebook or Twitter. And you can catch us at our website, therationalprogressive.com. Thank you once again. Have a great week.